fine. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our visiting speaker this afternoon, who's Dr. Dara Curran. Dara holds his PhD from Maynooth University, and he's an independent historian with research interests including associational culture, Ulster politics, and the social history of Northern Ireland. And he has publications in those fields, including a book published in 2014 on the Protestant community in Ulster, 1825 to 1845, published by Four Courts Press. And his most recent book has just been published, also by Four Courts. He tells me it's just reached the publisher today, and it should be available through online and physical bookshops, if we still have those, in the very near future. So his new monograph is The Rise and Fall of the Orange Order During the Famine, from Reformation to Dolly's Bray. And as I say, that has just been published by Four Courts Press. And it's on a subject related to his recent research that Dara is going to speak to us this afternoon. He's going to talk about the revival of the Orange Order in the 1840s, a smooth process. And Dara doesn't have any slides, so he's going to speak directly to camera. So Dara, if you're there, over to you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be given this opportunity to bring to your attention the book that Peter has just mentioned. So to provide a flavour of the book, this paper will focus on the revival of the Orange Order, which had been officially disbanded in 1836, and it will examine the reasons why its revival, which began in 1844, was such a slow and contentious process. The broad issues which held up the speed of revival were the partial breakdown of class deference, the issue of tenant right, the famine, and the need for the upper classes to tread carefully before wholly committing to a newly reformed Orange Order. A discussion of these issues will provide a basic guideline to the core of this book. Firstly, a brief background explanation is needed in order to explain why such a popular nationwide organisation dissolved itself in 1836. Well, since its formation over 40 years previously, the government had looked upon it with some toleration, but mainly with general suspicion. Because of its size and the fact that it was well armed with yeomanry weaponry, the order had the potential to disrupt the peace that the government so badly had sought in Ireland, and this was a regular occurrence. By the 1830s, policing in Ireland had been restructured and the magistracy had been culled as part of the general reform policy undertaken by successive governments. Many members of the Whig government strongly opposed the order and actively sought its disbandment. This opportunity presented itself following an 1835 government inquiry which found that Orange lodges existed within the army, which was a possible, if unlikely, threat to national security. A fanciful plot to assassinate the future Queen Victoria, which seemed to imply Orange involvement, added to the pressure that the upper class Orange Order leaders were under. So in order to maintain respectability and avoid the shame of a government ban, leadership took the decision to disband the Orange Order in 1836. But the question needs to be asked whether this decision had any impact on the predominantly lower class rank and file membership. Because in reality, a decision taken by the elite classes who inhabited a world far removed from the everyday lives of weavers, factory workers, tenant farmers, and labourers meant little to these people. Quite simply, the order played too central a part in their lives to give up. Membership provided an escape from the monotony and hardship of everyday life in a time of economic hardship and an overcrowded landscape. It provided a social outlet and a feeling of belonging and indeed importance not readily present in other aspects of their lives. There was also, in some but not all areas of Ulster, the feeling that a defensive force was needed against the Catholic-ridden society. But while the need for defence from perceived Catholic hostility was a practical reason for joining the order, for many people, the social aspect provided the principal enticing attraction. Thus, during the years of official non-existence, Orange activity continued throughout the province. Granted, the large processions and celebrations of marching season were greatly curtailed, but at the micro-local level, lodges met and carried on much as normal. Therefore, one might wonder why the need for reformation at all in 1844. Well, at a national level, the Catholic champion Daniel O'Connell continued his agitation with a crusade for repeal of the Union. But while this would have been a general worry for Protestants, the campaign was greatly diluted by the government's ban on a proposed Munster meeting at Clontarf. More real for many ground-level Protestants were the activities of Catholic ribbon societies, which had been somewhat revived indirectly by O'Connell's repeal campaign. Sufficient apprehension existed among members of the Protestant community to reform the Grand Lodge of Ulster in February 1844, quote, to give mutual support and defence in these perilous times, unquote. Although the Grand Lodge of Ireland had been revived in 1837, it had proven to be inept and of little value as a central controlling body. The new Grand Lodge of Ulster immediately called for unity and sought to meet deputations from the lodges scattered throughout the province. This call was generally heeded, which resulted in two bodies, a toothless one in Dublin and an active one in Coleraine, acting as the central bodies of Orangism in Ireland. In reality, the Grand Lodge of Ulster was the dominant and much more relevant of the two. The main reason for this was that it was a body bereft of elite class involvement. Among the ground level Orangemen, a feeling of betrayal pervaded towards the upper class leadership of the order. In voting the order out of existence in 1836, leadership, unsurprisingly, had not consulted with its membership in any way, nor had it seemed to provide a stern enough defence against its detractors. Although ordinary Orangemen had certainly not always followed leadership instruction, having the upper classes as figures of leadership lent an inflated legitimacy and a sense of importance to their activities. But by weakly bowing to government pressure, the upper classes had abandoned their fellow Orange brethren with seemingly little consideration. This bitter taste of betrayal was played out in a changing society that has seen the traditional class deference being slowly eroded since the previous century. In an era of enormous transition, the paternal ties that had bound the classes had loosened to a certain degree. This was partly due to landlords seeking to modernise their estates in order to extract maximum profit, which adversely infringed on the living conditions of the tenantry. Leases became shortened, rents set in times of prosperity remained high, and security on the land greatly lessened. In addition to this, because of government, judicial and police reform, the influence held by Orange leaders in the dispensation of justice also had been weakened, meaning that favour could no longer be expected in the court of law. Previously, Protestant lower class discontent had manifested itself in the formation of pressure groups such as Steel Boys, Oak Boys, and more latterly, Tommy Downshires. The Orange Order had to some extent allowed social leadership to be regained by the upper classes, but this had been undone damagingly by the capitulation of 1836. In reforming the Grand Lodge of Ulster, the order had been largely stripped back to its 1795 original form, a lower and middle class organisation largely lacking upper class involvement. There would be little urgency in seeking the return of the elites. Resistance to the re-entry of this class would prove to be a sizable object in the path to eventual and complete revival. But for the upper classes, a difficult path had to be tread. Since the order's beginnings, the issue of violence had plagued it. Clashes with Catholics had resulted in loss of life on several notable occasions, something that could not be tolerated by London governments intent on pacifying Ireland. Being associated with an organisation that broke the law of the land and threatened its stability placed its leadership in an awkward and embarrassing position. Some magistrates had already been removed for participating in Orange activities, as the government made it clear that it had no time for displays of Orangism by passing successive acts prohibiting parades and displays of colour. A favour and acceptance was to be retained within wider elite circles, then membership of the Orange Order had to cease, or at least be more covert. But it was quite clear that the ability of these upper classes to control core membership was somewhat tenuous, hence the initial decision to disband the order. That is not to say that those of an Orange disposition within the upper classes did not approve of Orangism as a whole. Other Orange-tinted organisations were set up to fill the void left by the order. Successive associations were formed, such as the Protestant Conservative Society and the Irish Metropolitan Conservative Society, to allow for a legitimate voice of protest. But just like the Brunswick clubs before them, these proved rather impotent. In any case, the cost of membership ensured no lower class involvement. Such associations proved to be of little use in bringing together a united class Orange front. Conversely, they merely served to keep the upper classes detached from the lower classes, which was the social norm. By the mid-1840s, upper-class Orangemen were still not ready to rejoin any new form of the Orange Order. On the other hand, the lower classes had no such qualms and gladly flocked to the new Grand Lodge of Ulster. The coincidental lifting of the Party Processions Act allowed these Orangemen the chance to parade legally through the summer of 1845. Discretion was advised by those such as Colonel Werner and Lord Roden, who had maintained their links with the order, but the size and number of the parades throughout Ulster indicate that little heed was taken by core membership. These parades were generally peaceful, but the death of a Catholic following clashes in Armagh was the very type of incident that the upper classes feared. Caution was heightened by the government dismissal of Magistrate and Deputy Lieutenant of County Antrim, James Watson, who had led a procession to Derry. Despite outrage and a number of protest meetings, even ultras such as Werner again expressed restraint. He, quote, did not wish to be supposed as an advocate for Orange processions. On the contrary, he had expressed his disapprobation frequently. he thought it would be better to abstain from them altogether, unquote. This attitude was mirrored by the Earl of Enniskillen, who did not attend the annual August the 12th procession in his hometown. From the platform, Monaghan Grandmaster Arthur Holmes warned, quote, that deeply regretting the absence of many of the aristocracy who should, in our opinion, identify themselves with us in the great constitutional movement this day, we pledge ourselves to support none who do not come forward and join our loyal and venerated institution, unquote. The Earl of Enniskillen had been Grand Master of the Order upon dissolution. However, he was not prepared to lend his support to a revival of the Orange Order as yet. At this point, a distance remained between the newly formed Grand Lodge of Ulster and the skeleton leadership of the old and unreformed Grand Lodge of Ireland. Despite apparent public indifference, many among the upper classes were moving towards the idea of a full-scale revival of the order. The wider context of the mid-1840s played its part in this. For example, the ongoing revival of evangelicalism had the effect of polarizing many people on both sides of the religious divide. Convinced more than ever of the righteousness of Protestantism, some among the better classes felt the need to guard against increased Catholic influence. This was particularly evident during the Maynooth crisis, as a pan-Protestant front emerged to oppose the proposed government funding of the training of priests. Outrage was increased by the murders of Magistrates Booth and MacLeod in Cavan and Leitrim, respectively. These murders, allegedly carried out by ribbonmen, moved the Dublin Evening Mail to warn that, quote, at no point since '98 was the country so convulsed as at present. We appear to be on the verge of sanguinary insurrection, and the symptoms of a malignant civil war are showing themselves with an impatience which hardly submits to a restraint, unquote. Such alarmism saw a desire from some among the elites for the order to be reformed on a national scale, but on the presumption that they would return to their previous leadership positions. With this in mind, a meeting was called for Enniskillen in late August 1845. This meeting was convened with the aim of a national revival of the Orange Order under the leadership of a Grand Lodge of Ireland in Dublin. What it did not take into consideration was the existing Grand Lodge of Ulster and the feelings of ordinary Orangemen. Jonathan Matheson points out that, quote, below the surface, palpable hostility and suspicion among many within the lower orders and to an extent within the middle class was directed towards their social betters who had so easily abandoned them in 1836, unquote. Such feeling, coupled with a condescending general upper-class dismissal of the Grand Lodge of Ulster, ensured that the Enniskillen meeting did not go to plan. A deputation from the Grand Lodge of Ulster attended the meeting, but did not meet with the reception they might have hoped for. The Ulster delegation found itself excluded from many of the discussions held as the Enniskillen faction attempted to replace its leadership with its own without consultation. An equally contentious issue arose with the proposal to rename the Orange Order. This was met with fury by the Ulster delegation, who refused to countenance such an idea. Further anger met the proposal to abolish the use of secret passwords, oaths, and rituals. The abolition of these would have denied the core membership the enjoyment and excitement that drew many of them to join. Enraged with the day's proceedings, the Ulster faction refused to cede power to Enniskillen and left. But for the elites, such as Werner, Sir Arthur Brooke, the Earl of Farnham, and the Earl of Enniskillen, these same issues were the very obstacles that had caused their initial reluctance to reform the order. On the issue of leadership, it was considered perfectly normal that these should reassume their position, as the lower classes could not be allowed to lead such a large armed organisation. The social dictates of the day scorned on any idea of lower class leadership of any worthwhile body. It is widely believed that those that came from outside the upper classes did not have the education, the wealth, the judgment, or the social skills to assume leadership positions. In addition to this, adherence to the law had to be maintained. In their own minds, only the better classes could ensure this. In this same vein, the secrecy of the order had to be dropped as oaths and rituals threatened the very legality that the elites so desperately sought. In order to withstand the attacks of opponents, the order had to be seen as a law-abiding, transparent organisation. But while these ideals certainly had their merits, they ran contrary to what core membership expected of the order. Hence the almost immediate breakdown in relations between the factions, as the Grand Lodge of Ulster declared itself to be, quote, steadily proceeding to a fixed determination to maintain Orangism in all its integrity, unquote. In any event, the Enniskillen faction seemed in little hurry to establish a new central body. It was not until August of 1846 that they issued circulars requesting all Orangemen to meet for new discussions. This request was ignored by the Grand Lodge of Ulster, meaning that only Enniskillen loyalists were present at the meeting. Despite this glaring absence, those present voted for the Grand Lodge of Ireland to be reformed after 10 years in the wilderness. With the requisite actions to ensure legality having been taken, the Earl of Enniskillen was declared Grand Master. The fact, however, that only 19 positions were filled indicates the small numbers in attendance and the lack of general interest in this faction. The Grand Lodge of Ulster stubbornly stated its determination, quote, to stand by themselves and not join with the Orangemen connected with the Grand Lodge of Ireland, unquote. Therefore, although officially re-established, the Grand Lodge of Ireland was merely a skeleton organisation of the upper classes and in no way representative of rank and file Orangemen. For a number among these rank and file Orangemen, the issue of tenant right would further cause them to examine their relationship with the upper classes. The increasing lack of security on the land had led to the formation of the Ulster Tenant Right Association under the leadership of William Sharman Crawford. Seeking, among other things, the legalisation of the Ulster custom, the association attracted many Protestant, but especially Presbyterian tenants. While the majority of Presbyterians were firmly in the Unionist camp, Andrew Holmes points out that they were not necessarily politically conservative and that, quote, many remained ardent political liberals and supported a wide range of reform measures, including tenant right, unquote. The Presbyterian clergy happily embraced any cause that threatened to disrupt the grip held on the land by Church of Ireland landlords and lent their support to this cause. A key figure was Dr. James McKnight, the Presbyterian editor of the London Dairy Standard. Catholic clergy also embraced this issue as the association transcended sectarian lines. The Anglo-Celt reported that an early meeting held in Ballybay, quote, consisted of Roman Catholics, Presbyterians and Protestants, Orangemen and Repealers, unquote. Such meetings were replicated throughout Ulster as the association gained momentum. This momentum was a worry for the landed gentry who had dominated the upper ranks of the Orange Order. As highlighted by Alan Blackstock, quote, clearly economic issues threatened to disrupt class and creed unity, unquote. This disruption was added to by the fact that Orangemen seeking tenant right were more likely to be affiliated with the Grand Lodge of Ulster, which was, of course, lacking in elite leadership. A delicate path needed to be followed as the new Grand Lodge of Ireland could not afford to alienate the very Orangemen it sought to regain control over. It could not allow the issue of tenant right to disrupt its desire for Orange unity. So to deflect the real issue, MacKnight was targeted as he bore the brunt of attacks on tenant right, with his character being assassinated in the ultra-Protestant press. Labelling him, quote, the itinerant tenant right doctor, unquote, the Dublin Evening Mail accused MacKnight of, quote, advocating the imaginary right and thus, in many cases, pledging the members of the lodges to adopt the doctrine of the doctor, unquote. But to blame MacKnight for arousing the tenantry was greatly deflecting from the real issue. To claim, as the Dublin Evening Mail did, that tenant right was an abstract issue and that tenantry had hitherto not been involved in land agitation was out of touch with reality and simply incorrect. It is difficult to quantify the level of support that tenant right gained amongst Orangemen, however. MacKnight's Standard newspaper claimed widespread support. For instance, it claimed that 9/10 of Dungannon Orangemen supported tenant right. But the real test would present itself at the upcoming 1848 12th celebrations, which the association hoped would turn into a display of support for their cause. The association would have its biggest success at Garva, where the procession of Orangemen did turn into a demonstration in favour of tenant right. North Derry was to provide a fertile recruiting ground for the association, which is not surprising as this was Grand Lodge of Ulster heartland. MacKnight was paraded through the town and allowed to canvass from the platform. District Grandmaster David Smith claimed that the object of the meeting, quote, was to ask the gracious sovereign to prevent the landlords from robbing the tenant farmers of their just rights, unquote. But amongst the estimated attendance of around 20,000, the limitations of unquestioning support became obvious as some Orangemen refused to enter the field, claiming that while they supported the idea of tenant right, the 12th was not the day on which to agitate for it. In other areas, downright hostility was evident. In Carrickfergus, one of the speakers was interrupted by a person asking, quote, is tenant right to be the law of the land, unquote. The culprit was immediately grasped by the neck and taken out of the meeting, despite arguing that, quote, he was as good a Protestant as any of them, unquote. A similar abrupt fate befell a member of the crowd in Dromore, who loudly asked the Marquis of Downshire, who was seated on the platform, if he would, quote, reduce the rents and pay the poor rates for us, unquote. In Dungannon, an attempt was made to raise a tenant right flag, but it was pulled down after a minute with, quote, strong intimation given to the parties not to attempt displaying it for a second time, unquote. These instances would indicate support for tenant right among some Orangemen, but the fact that most gatherings on the 12th passed off without disruption would point to a certain reluctance on the part of Orangemen to see through the tenant right campaign when it came into direct conflict with tradition and suspicion of Catholics. At its maid, Sharman Crawford blamed, quote, the old no popery cry, unquote, and bemoaned the fact that, quote, the Orangemen are now stimulated and caressed by those who had before deserted them, unquote. This may have been overstating the still tenuous influence of the upper classes, but whatever the reason for rank and file reluctance to champion the tenant right cause on this invaluable stage, it was a hammer blow for the Tenant Right Association. Its activities did continue, but momentum had been well and truly broken as Orangemen, despite their being lukewarm towards the landed classes, chose not to wholeheartedly support the campaign. A probable hindrance to an all-out concerted tenant right campaign was the ongoing famine. Although the severity of the situation was played down by the righteous upper classes, there is no doubt that starvation and disease were prevalent throughout Ulster, with many Orangemen and their families falling victim. Although some individual landlords did take part in helping their tenants, the Grand Lodge of Ulster did not make any charitable contribution to the Protestant needy. This could have been an opportunity to gain the appreciation of Orangemen, but it was passed over. Advice not to meet and march in procession from the better classes and religious leaders was again largely ignored, as those physically able to march most certainly did. Granted, numbers were greatly reduced, but once again, the independent spirit of individual Orangemen was very much in evidence. At this point, there still seemed no real prospect of a unified Orange body coming into place. What would ultimately unite Orangemen throughout the country would be the Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848. In breaking with O'Connell's repeal association, Young Ireland sought to attract Orangemen to its ranks with its non-sectarian ethos and mixed leadership. But while an issue such as tenant right could unite Catholic and Protestant, outright severance from Britain certainly could not. Despite campaigning throughout Ulster, Young Ireland could make no inroads with Orangemen. In fact, these Orangemen vowed to organise and lend assistance to the government in the event of a rebellion. But the fact that such offers were refused by Dublin Castle added to a growing hysteria amongst the Protestant population, which felt abandoned by the very government that is supposed to protect it. Thus, a feeling grew that it was up to Orangemen themselves to defend against rebellion. At ground level, it was the familiar figures of the magistracy that undertook the task of Orange mobilisation. Despite the loss of much of their legal power, magistrates were still heavily influential at local level and remained as cornerstones of the community. Because of this familiarity, magistrates were more directly influential than the elite classes and therefore more likely to be listened to. Many magistrates have served as district masters, and in a threatening situation such as this, rank and file Orangemen looked to these familiar figures for guidance. It must be remembered that most magistrates were bound through benefaction to the elite classes, meaning that the elites could insert their influence through their patronage. Indirectly, the perceived danger posed by young Ireland resulted in something of a reconnection occurring between the classes. The feeling of impending rebellion would ensure a massive demonstration of Orange strength on the 12th of July. In addition to the huge numbers of ordinary Orange men who turned out, the return of many of the old leaders was evident. With rebellion now on the horizon, the upper classes who had previously backed away from publicly displaying their allegiances now felt justified and comfortable in joining Orange demonstrations. Backing this point, the Grand Lodge of Antrim reported that, quote, in the district of Belfast alone, the ranks were augmented nearly twofold, among whom are many of the most respectable and influential members of the community, unquote. This occurrence was replicated throughout Ulster as large numbers of Protestants joined or returned to the Orange fold, primarily because of frenzied reports of rebel activity. The newsletter summed up that, quote, it is manifest that of late the Orangemen, so far from having their ranks thinned or their loyalty deadened by the recent monster growth of republicanism and disaffection, have been spurred on by it to renewed activity and more enthusiastic ardour, unquote. Such an influence of enthusiastic numbers and impending danger could only help bring unity among Orangemen. The fact that the rebellion was almost a non-event and such a dismal failure did not halt Orange momentum. With the elites back on board and now sanctioning the physical confrontation that many lower men craved but had never been granted in previous years, it is almost inevitable that the Orange Order would come together as one once more. The Grand Lodge of Ulster met in Limavady, quote, for the purpose of considering the question of an amalgamation with the Grand Lodge of Ireland, unquote. It was decided at a November 1848 meeting of the Grand Lodge of Ireland to proceed with new talks with the Ulster faction. Following the winter months, a Coleraine meeting of the Grand Lodge of Ulster resolved to amalgamate with the national body. This union was forthcoming in May, allowing the Grand Lodge of Ireland to take full control as the central authoritative body of the Orange Order in Ireland for the first time in 13 years. Leadership positions returned to the elite classes. The lesser classes returned to their previous roles in the lower ranks of the organisation, their brief sojourn at the head of the Grand Lodge of Ulster over. So to conclude, it is clear to see that the need for a revival of the Orange Order was necessary. But this revival, however, was no straightforward process, seamlessly picking up where 1836 had left off. In a period of great societal transition, there were a number of issues to overcome. Famine and the issue of tenant right proved to be formidable roadblocks, but perhaps the most stubborn was internal dispute, as the lower classes refused to roll over and cede power once the elites had pleased themselves that it was safe for them to rejoin. The relationship between the classes had already been on shifting ground as the new century had progressed. Along with issues occurring at national and provincial level, it can be seen that bitterness and mistrust played a key role in the laboured process that saw the eventual reunion of the Orange Order. It would ultimately take an issue as seismic as the threat of countrywide rebellion to repair this relationship and bring about unity once more within Orangeism. Thank you.
Dara, thank you for such a fascinating paper on a really important topic. I'm sure there will be lots of questions that people want to ask. So for those of you kind of unfamiliar with Teams, there is a little hand icon at the top of your screen. If you click on that, that will just flag you want to that flag that you want to ask a question. You might just need to unmute yourself at the same time just to make sure that I see that. And then I will invite you to ask a question once I see that hand raised. So we already have one up, so let's move straight into Q&A. So Francis, you're on first.
Hello, that was a fascinating discussion. Really appreciate it. One of the questions I would like to ask is, did the working class Orange Order members have a view on what was happening around them during the famine? You know, you mentioned that there was the order itself didn't seem to take any view on the famine, on the effects that were in the countryside, but it must have affected working class Orange Order members. Is there any evidence that did happen and that they did make any sort of representations that did reach the upper echelons of the Orange Order?
There's no real, there's no real evidence to suggest that they reached out to the upper classes for any sort of assistance at an Orange level. There doesn't seem to have been that sort of relationship in place that sort of would allow such a thing to happen. They did on a more personal level themselves. They did have a great awareness of what was happening throughout the province and indeed throughout the country. And you did get lots of individual members and individual lodges raising money themselves to donate to local charitable organizations. Probably the problem was for a lot of the organizations that were in place, they sort of still had this idea that they were, raising funds for organizations such as Protestant orphans, for example, or still with the idea of converting Catholics in places like Connacht. So a lot of the time, the sort of organizations, those charitable organizations that were organized by the better classes, the money they organized or that they gathered didn't always trickle its way down to the ordinary people in the streets of Belfast or whatever. It has often moved to different places that probably didn't really need it as much at that time. But you would have individual members and lodges and people in the processions donating to funds and raising money for things like the hospital in Belfast, for example, but no real sign of, money trickling down to ordinary Orange men from the better classes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Francis. Just a reminder to people that once you've asked your question, if you wouldn't mind just clicking the hand icon again, that takes your hand down again. That would be great. Okay, second question. Sorry, gentleman with Hebrew account name. Sorry, not one of my languages. So if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself and asking your question.
Peter, it's myself, Guy Biner.
Oh, it's Guy. Hi.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the Hebrew name there. It's my university imposed it on me, and I've asked them to translate it to English. We'll see if they'll do it. All right, Dara, I wanted to ask you a question, which relates, I guess, to the interface of image and reality, or what's happening on the ground, and it's twofold. I was wondering, on the one hand, to what extent was 1848 a real threat, or to what extent was it a manipulated threat? Because it didn't seem like there was going to be a massive rising right up in Ulster, and yet clearly it was used and manipulated in the press, and that I think is an interesting point. And the other thing I wanted to add to that, if I may, you talk about a reunion of the Orange Order, right? I mean, that's how we see it. We as historians build a narrative out of this, which stresses continuity. But I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that the revived Orange Order is a new order? Meaning, it seems to me far more populist in today's terms, what we would call populist, but far more, let's call it lower class, I mean, it's been shattered and changed, so it's a new, it's effectively, it seems to me, a different organization. Even though we use the term we see the continuity, but to what extent do you see change there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to answer about the rebellion 1848, was it ever sort of realistic? You know, obviously it wasn't a realistic threat, but there was an awful lot of alarmism and scaremongering going on, especially in Ulster. And I found loads of stuff in the National Archives from magistrates writing to Dublin Castle saying that we're totally surrounded by these rebels and they're really well armed and they're just waiting to pounce on us at any minute. And we don't have any arms at all. So there was all these calls to the government, please give us down some arms, which of course they didn't do, because the government knew themselves that this rebellion, this whole thing was pretty much a non-runner. And they had sort of quietly stocked up with new battalions, and a lot of new troops had flooded into Ireland sort of in a quiet way. So they were well prepared to handle any rising that might actually occur. And they didn't need the Orange Order, but the Orange Order took their silence as a sort of an abandonment of them. They felt abandoned. You know, here's the government. We're crying out for arms. They're not bothering about us. They're just saying that, yeah, thanks, but no thanks sort of thing. So there was an awful lot of alarmism in newspapers, and magistrates especially bombarded Dublin Castle with requests for help, offering help, looking for arms. And, you know, the whole rebellion was a farce. The government had their spies in place. They knew everything that was going on. So it wasn't ever a real runner, but in Ulster especially, it was considered to be a real threat. Second part of the question, was it, you know, a totally new order that came into place in 1844? I'd probably argue that, yeah, it was a new order, but it is a traditional sort of a new order, if you know what I mean. It is going back to 1795 and the formation of the order and the raw Orange Order that came into place at that time before it had been diluted down by the upper classes coming on board. So it was, on an extent, yes, a new order, but it was something that would harken back to previous years. And unfortunately, we never really get to find out, because as the rest of the book will tell you then, Dolly Spray came about and the whole thing sort of imploded again. And after Dolly Spray as well, you know, that relationship still remained a bit tenuous. And once again, you have the better classes jumping ship, the lower classes sort of been left to their own devices yet again. So for the rest of the century, really probably up as far as maybe the Third Home Rule crisis, I would say, that relationship doesn't really get repaired to any great extent. So it does remain very much a populist movement, I would suggest, yes.
Thank you, Guy, and apologies for not recognizing you there in your hobbit hole. Sean, you're next.
Dara, thank you very much for excellent paper. I just want to press you a little bit further on the issue of government. There's 2 points, really. I mean, one is, can the government really have been as relaxed as all that? Because this isn't just an Irish crisis. You've got insurrection in France, in Italy, in the Habsburg Empire and elsewhere. And of course, in the United Kingdom, you have Chartism. So I mean, this is very much the Irish manifestation of a wider crisis. And certainly John Savile's work would show that the government is monitoring what's happening as something that's not just confined to Ireland. The question really is, isn't it the case that behind the scenes, Clarendon did send emissaries, military attaches, to make contact with the Orange men in case they were going to be needed. And Jonathan Maddison in his work certainly suggests that psychologically this is very important, that Orange men right through the 1850s and 60s feel that they were betrayed, that when the government needed them, it was ready to consider arming them. And then as soon as the crisis was over, it dumps them again with the dismissal of Roden and the reimposition of Party Possessions Act. So, I mean, there is a wider political background here, isn't there?
There is, yeah. I mean, the whole 1848, the whole European rebellion thing that's going on and what has happened in places like Paris and Berlin and that, it certainly is a very scary sort of a situation for the government. And you had sort of, you know, the Chartists as well in England at the time being closely monitored. They definitely didn't, you know, they weren't relaxed about it. They did bring in so many new troops. Clarendon himself actually took the precaution of moving his own family out of Dublin and back over to the safety of England. So it wasn't something that they sort of were not taken seriously, but it does look like they had the situation in hand and they did know what, you know, possibly could happen here because of, you know, looking at the European situation. But, you know, with the arrests as well and the transportation of people like Mitchell, and, you know, they pretty much had this organization sort of decimated by the time of the uprising, the attempted uprising in Tipperary. So it does look to me like they did have it well in hand. But as you say about the Orange men, they did send their emissaries, although this was pretty much denied at a later stage by the government. But people like Colonel Fair, I think was his name, and was there Turner as well, went to meet with Orange representatives. The Earl of Enniskillen was involved. And afterwards, the order would claim that, yes, this very much was a government approach to us. And they did say that they would give us arms. I think they provided money and a possibility to bring arms across from Birmingham. The government would totally play this down in the 1850s and say that, well, we didn't really, you know, approach you, or we didn't need you. And it was, as you say, a source of some bitterness for Orange leadership because they felt that their offers of help and this possibility of the government bringing them on board was very much dismissed. So, yes, there was a quite an awareness really of what potentially could happen from the government, but it does seem to me that they did have things well under control, and there never was really a possibility that it could have gone to a European extent. So that's what I would think about that particular situation.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Mervyn Bustede is next.
Thank you. Dara, thanks. That sounds like a very scholarly piece of work. Just wondering, what chief sources have you relied upon? I'm assuming, for example, that there are no large records available for that period.
Yeah, that is a bit of a problem, all right. When I went to Belfast to the Grand Lodge, they didn't really have anything available as regards to that particular period. It's mostly post-famine stuff they have over there. So I kind of was dependent a lot on the National Archives in Dublin, the police reports from the Chief Secretary. Those sort of tend to give you a good view of what is happening at ground level. So in terms of primary source material, that probably is the sort of the best material that you could get your hands on. But the newspapers as well, you know, you're looking at different newspapers, and, you know, some of them are very ultra, like the Dublin Evening Mail, for example, and you try to do the normal thing of balancing these newspapers out against each other. So it was unfortunately a bit of a problem that the Grand Lodge didn't really have a whole lot that could help me. But as you know, just tried my best really to work my way around it, and you know, again, unfortunately, as usual in history, the lower classes really aren't leaving anything behind them that we can use. So it's just like everything, you just have to judge and balance it for yourself, really.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mervyn. Do we have other questions? I might just ask one while we're waiting for any other hands to go up. So Dara, yeah, thanks very much for that paper, and it's really striking what you were saying about the attempts by the tenant right movement to infiltrate's the wrong word, but to gain support from within this populist wing of the Orange Order. And there's evidence for that after the crisis of 1848, when the Tenant League is reviving in 1849, 1850, to the extent that in 1850, the League organises a major rally on the River Boyne on the 12th of July, though it actually moves it back a couple of days to allow the Presbyterians to come down from the General Assembly. But there is this continuing attempt to win over Orange support even after 1848. And in some ways, I'm wondering, well, something you didn't talk about, but I'm wondering whether what is potentially more damaging for Catholic Protestant collaboration is the politics of religion around the papal aggression and the Ecclesiastical Titles Bill in 1851, and its fallout into the subsequent years with the development of the Catholic Defence Association, which has an uneasy relationship with the Tenant League from 1851 onwards.
Yeah, I think, that really was the killer for the Tenant Right Association, was the whole papal aggression situation that the Pope was trying to bring about in England again. That really sort of brought a sectarian edge to the whole Tenant Right sort of idea. And it did sort of spell its downfall, and I think that was 1851 that happened in. And that brought sort of sectarian lines to it, and it was a big turn-off for Presbyterians and their clergy, who have been, heavily involved in the whole organisation. It's probably interesting as well that after Dolly's Bray, the upper classes in the order take a decision to take a more parliamentary route to voice their protest. And for the 1852 general election, there's a big sort of an effort by the better classes to really organise themselves properly. And it's borne out really in the fact that in the whole of Ulster, I think there's only one Liberal candidate elected, and Sharman Crawford himself didn't even get elected. So there was that as well. And the fact as well then that you had the whole Sadler and Keogh incident as well, where they jumped ship and joined the government. That is another blow. So you did have a sort of a disintegration along sectarian lines of the Tenant Right Association. And the fact as well, generally, that the 1850s, things did get a bit better for society, and the sort of pressing need for land reform wasn't as obvious as it had been, say, in the 1830s or 40s. And it sort of coincides with that kind of quiet time up until about the mid 1860s or so, that not a big lot was really happening. Although it is interesting that in 1870, in the land wars, some Fermanagh Orangemen did sort of get involved, and they did take an interest in the same way as had been in the 1840s. But I think they were soon warned off and told, get back into line here, and this isn't a route that we're going to follow this time.
That's great. Thanks for that answer, Dara. I think Ed is waiting to ask a question.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the fascinating paper, Dara. I just had a question there. You touched on it there when you were talking about thinking a little bit about maybe the Fermanagh exception there in terms of inter-county slight divergences. I was wondering whether you saw any more pronounced divergences. Thinking even of the sort of the political evolution of people like Arthur Foster in Donegal, who seemed to initially in the 1860s want to cautiously, in terms of his failed political career, appeal to a liberal Presbyterianism in the county, as well as sort of trying to balance his wider Orange interests in Ireland and his position as a senior Orangeman in the country. So I was just wondering to what extent you saw that type of inter-county or regional divergences, west of the Bann, South Ulster, and whether that sort of, if you could just say a little bit more about that, or if that's a real thing, or whether it's any divergences are really exaggerated and the movement kind of generally tends to move as a whole.
Yeah, there was sort of, a bit of divergence, especially in County Monaghan. County Monaghan didn't join up with the Grand Lodge of Ulster. They sort of maintained their own separate lodge structure in Monaghan. They were veering towards the Grand Lodge of Ireland, but they didn't actually, totally align themselves to it. But they wouldn't align themselves to Ulster either, because, they seen it as not actually being legal. This Ulster Grand Lodge wasn't legal, and Monaghan considered that their warrants actually weren't worth anything, that they were totally worthless. So Monaghan, for that reason, wouldn't join up with the Grand Lodge of Ulster. So you have that diversion in County Monaghan. Dublin then as well, Dublin doesn't seem to really know what it wants. Some of them go with Ulster, some of them go with Enniskillen, and it stays that way really until they sort of get back together in 1848. So it's probably a bit more complicated than I have shown in my paper here now, just because of time constraints and that I couldn't include everything. But yeah, you do then sort of, there is, after Dolly Spray, there is a lot of sort of discontent, and you do get some lodges actually burning their warrants. Some say that we don't want to continue on with this because of the violence issue, but you get others that are, polarized by the whole thing, and they declare that they will carry on. But it's, the whole populist thing really does carry on, and it sort of manifests itself then with William Johnson of Ballykilbeg in the late 1860s as well. He becomes the sort of champion and the leader really of Orangeism, when in reality, because of his social position, he probably shouldn't have been. So this is something that sort of is breaking away from the old traditional leadership pattern. So it's definitely not smooth, and you go on to the early 1900s when you get the independent Orange Order as well, more kind of, how would you say, more interested in the working people kind of thing at that time. And what is really the third Home Rule crisis that kind of brings everything together. So there is a lot of sort of inter-county sort of stuff going on in different parts of the province, and that aren't always at one with each other, but it eventually does come together.
Thanks, Ed. Do we have any other questions? Anyone waiting to ask one? Put your hand up, or if I don't see it, just shout out. Sean, is that an old hand from you, or do you want to ask another one? Oh, we have one. Adrian Lloyd. Adrian, can you hear me? We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent. Go ahead.
Well, one thing I found about it, you had young men, and it takes a balance. And any time there was dispute, the likes of the Earls and the Gentry they had the money to flee, and these were influential men and had their sway. But any time there was unrest, they would have cleared off. And then what happened? You would have had a lot of young men, respect from their fathers and stuff like that there, seeing their land getting taken, you know what I mean, or extortionate rents at that time. But at the same time, too, I do notice when the formation of the Orange Order in 1795, that was an amalgamation of other things prior to that. So there were still teething issues with that when it came in. And then the restructure again in 1836 to 1845, you know what I mean? I noticed that a lot of the people were afraid, a lot of the gentry, what I would class as the gentry, they were afraid to put their head on the block and sat around, and then when there were certain issues, they dodged it, you know what I mean, and had the money to fly away, you know what I mean, or get away from it, you know what I mean, and that's where I find today there's still the Lord Enniskillen Memorial Fund. It's still up and running. It still runs to this day, and that's supposed to help orphans, the children of Orange men and women. You know what I mean? There's lots of things that still is kept intact, but the Orange Order, I don't believe, was a political. It was a religious, but again, who were taking advice and instruction from ministers and reverend people, you know what I mean? Which they would have had their sway, you know what I mean? It's not like it's documented right down. It was filtered down a wee bit, added on right through. And that's what I found now when it restructured and got leadership. Well, it's what you said there on the other. When was that one? When it restructured and got leadership and it kind of like amalgamated as one, you still had the thieving issues. You know what I mean? Certain men between the Grand Lodge of Ulster still had power in people. You know what I mean? The numbers of people, which is a big threat.
Okay. Thanks, Adrian. Do you want to come back on anything there, Dara?
Yeah, I mean, the teething issues will always be there, you know, and they're probably still there at this stage. And, you know, just the difficulty in controlling the masses of people has always been there. And if you lend your name as an upper class person, if you lend your name to this organization and there's a riot in which people get killed, well, your neck is on the block, yes. And, you know, that's something that the upper classes, it's always been a kind of a delicate balance down the years for them.
Okay, thanks. We'll move on to another question from Jay.
Thanks, Dara, for a really interesting paper. I've been trying to figure out how to put my question, how to articulate it. So I want to sketch out kind of a different sort of trajectory in thinking about the late 1830s and early 1840s. Because it seems to me that the political story of the 1830s, the second half of the 1830s, is a story about Protestant paranoia leading to ultimately to the greatest victory the conservatives have until the later part of the 19th century, and then a feeling of betrayal once ultra-conservatives or ultra-Tories rather are kind of thrown to the side because the appeal doesn't need their votes and their support. And so I'm wondering where the story of the everyday people that you're talking about in the early 1840s, where their activity is being organized when we consider the fact that, of course, O'Connell is traveling across the nation, rallying tens and hundreds of thousands of people, and whether elites really are that broken from, or that disjointed from everyday people that share their political and their religious background. So not really the greatest formation of the question, but I'm just kind of curious about where that political story is between elites, quote unquote, and your everyday Orangemen in the early 1840s, as O'Connell is probably terrorizing people, his political power at least, more than any potential rebellion might be.
Yeah, well, you know, if you sort of start from the 1830s, well, it did look like Catholic emancipation had just happened without sort of, a Protestant glove being laid on it. It sort of went through so easily. So when it comes to O'Connell in 1832 or whatever, deciding to start off his repeal campaign, the elites really are up for it this time, and they're not going to be caught unawares again. And they organise, mass meetings around Ulster. There's huge meetings in places like Hillsborough, Dungannon, Enniskillen, etc. And this brings, probably maybe by accident, a sort of a political awareness to the lower classes. They might not have had, a great knowledge of what was going on out there, all the nitty-gritty detail of it, but they do sort of know that we're under threat here. O'Connell is the enemy. These ribbon men are re-emerging as well. They're a real physical enemy. And to an extent, that these Protestant lower classes do get politicised throughout the 1830s. And, they do have a real enemy there. And these meetings, these huge meetings at Hillsborough and whatever, they are organised by the upper classes. So, maybe I sort of overemphasised this sort of breakdown in deference or whatever. It was there to a slight degree, but it hadn't totally broken down or anything like it. The upper classes still could organise to get the lower classes from their estates and get them transported to somewhere like Dungannon, which might have been 20, 30 miles away. And this would be a major organisation, to bring a crowd of sort of 75,000 to Hillsborough in that era. This was a major organisation, and it had to be paid for by the upper classes. And the lower classes, they did need their incentive to be brought there. And a lot of the time, they were supplied with what we might call refreshments along the way. And this was a big part of it. The same with election contests. You often get Orange groups and Protestant groups turning up at election centres, and they have been well catered for in that area. And, just as ordinary blokes in the countryside, well, why wouldn't they go? At that stage, it's a day off work, it's a chance to get a good feed and a feed of drink as well. So, of course, they're going to go to these things, and they're going to know that, yes, something not good from our point of view is happening here. O'Connell is the enemy, repeal is the enemy, the Young Irelanders are the enemy, and there still is a sort of, the connection still is there from the upper classes down to the lower classes, most definitely. It hadn't completely severed or anything like that. So they were able to mobilise the lower classes when they needed it. But like I say, it was a fine line, and there couldn't be any violence and any deaths or anything like that. Well, it wasn't good from their point of view.
Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. We've probably got time for one more question if someone has been waiting to ask one. Just indicates now. This is your last call. All right, I'm not seeing any hands go up. But that's great. So look, we've had a great discussion. It's a really interesting subject, very important subject, under-researched. It's a great credit, I think, to Dara for taking this on and doing it so thoroughly. Just a reminder, his book is just out, The Rise and Fall of the Orange Order During the Famine from Reformation to Dolly's Bray. So look out for it, get it into your libraries. I'm certainly looking forward to reading it myself. So I'd like just to finish by thanking Dara again for giving us such a fascinating paper and insight into the complexities of what's happening in Ulster politics, and specifically within the Orange Order and its various factions at this time. What we might do is just, if everyone who's still with us could unmute, we can give Dara a round of applause in the traditional way. Thanks again, Dara. A reminder again, we do have another seminar next Monday at 4:30. Slight change of period and change of focus. We have Noel McLaughlin and Joanne Braniff speaking on The Politician and the Showman: History, Politics and Popular Music in 1960s Northern Ireland. Okay, so please join us at 4:30 next Monday if that's a topic of interest to you. Apart from that, thank you all for joining us from many different parts of the world, different countries, and it's great to have so many people taking part. So thank you again, and good afternoon.